The town of Dry Creek lay smothered in a restless silence, broken only by the creak of wooden signs swaying in the desert wind and the faint hum of lanterns burning low. Night in the frontier carried with it a kind of danger that daylight could never hold back. Shadows were long and men's tempers even longer, and on this night 2 sisters ran as if the earth itself had split open behind them. Mary's lungs burned with every breath, but she never let go of her sister's hand. Eliza's feet stumbled over loose gravel, skirts torn and face streaked with dust, but she kept running because Mary's grip was fierce, because Mary's voice, hoarse but steady, whispered, "Don't stop, not now." Behind them came the unmistakable clamor of pursuit. The sheriff's voice bellowed through the darkness, his commands carried sharp on the night air. Boots pounded against the dirt road. Lanterns swung wildly, throwing cruel arcs of light that chased the sisters like ghosts hungry for flesh. The sound of revolvers being cocked echoed like death-sown footsteps. Mary pulled Eliza down a narrow alley, heart thundering against her ribs. The town's false fronts and crooked buildings seemed to close in around them, trapping them like hunted animals. Dogs barked. A drunken voice jeered from a balcony above. Somewhere a door slammed. The whole town felt awake, watching, waiting for the lawmen to take 'em down. "Faster, Eliza," Mary urged, though her own legs trembled. "We can't let 'em catch us, we can't." Eliza's face was pale, her lips cracked with fear. She was younger, softer, not made for this kind of fight. She clutched at the hem of her dress, trying to keep it from tangling as she stumbled forward. "Mary, I can't." "Yes, you can." Mary's voice was low, fierce, but trembling with love. "You have to." And then came the sheriff himself. His broad frame filled the end of the alley, lantern-like glinting off the badge pinned to his chest. His man flanked him, revolvers raised, eyes sharp with hunger. He wasn't chasing a criminal. He was hunting prey. "There they are!" one deputy shouted. Mary's heart seized. She shoved Eliza behind her own body trembling but unyielding. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything. Her hand closed around the length of broken wood lying near a wagon wheel. A crude weapon, splintered and uneven, but it was all she had. The sheriff stepped forward, sneering, his voice thick with power. "It ends here, Mary. You hand over the girl, and maybe I'll show you mercy." Mary raised the wooden stave, her arms shaking. She felt the weight of Eliza's sobs behind her, felt the sheriff's shadow bearing down. She was terrified, but she would not let him touch her sister, not while breath still lived in her body. "You'll have to go through me," Mary spat, her voice ragged but steady. The sheriff's laughter was cold, cruel. "That can be arranged." The deputies moved in, their lanterns casting monstrous shapes on the walls. The night erupted with violence. Mary swung the wood with all the strength she had. It cracked against an arm, a jaw. The sound of bone meeting wood filled the alley. A deputy cursed, stumbling back. Another lunged forward, grabbing at Mary's dress. She tore free, wild, desperate. Gunfire split the night.
Mary was thrown to the ground, her breath knocked from her chest. Rough hands pinned her down, the wood wrenched from her grasp. The sheriff loomed above her, revolver glinting in his hand, his face carved in stone. Eliza sobbed, struggling against another deputy's grip. Mary's heart fractured at the sight. She could endure anything, but not this, not her sister torn away. With the last of her strength, she kicked, clawed, forcing the deputy's grip loose for a moment. "Run, Eliza!" she cried. "Run!" The girl tore free, stumbling into the open street, her small figure illuminated by the swinging lantern light. But the mob was quicker. Shouts rose, boots thundered. The circle was closing. Mary dragged herself to her knees, blood on her lip, vision blurred. She staggered in front of Eliza again, even as the sheriff raised his gun. And then, out of the shadows, he appeared. A A rider, silent, commanding. His horse's hooves struck sparks against the hard-packed dirt as he galloped into the chaos. A tall figure, hat brim low, coat trailing like wings of night. The crowd's roar faltered for an instant, confusion rippling like a wave. The sheriff turned, gun still raised, but the stranger gave no warning, no word. He simply drove his horse straight into the fray, scattering deputies like straw in the wind. Mary's heart caught. Eliza gasped. Dust and light and the thunder of hooves swallowed everything. The rancher reached down with a gloved hand. For one heart-stopping second, she saw his face, weathered by sun and silence, his eyes deep and unreadable, like a river that held more secrets than words ever could. He did not ask, he did not explain, he simply offered his hand. Mary grasped it. With a sudden heave, he pulled her up onto the saddle, then leaned to seize Eliza by the arm, hoisting her up as if she weighed nothing. "Hold on," was all he said, his first and only words. And then the horse lunged forward, cutting through the mob with unstoppable force. Shouts rang out, bullets tore the air, lanterns shattered against the ground. The sisters clung to him, the world a blur of dust and darkness. Behind them, the sheriff cursed, firing into the night. But the rancher rode with the fury of a storm, his silence heavier than thunder, his resolve unbreakable. The town vanished behind them, swallowed by shadow and distance. The sound of pursuit faded until only the wind remained, rushing cold and wild against their faces. Mary pressed her cheek against her sister's hair, tears burning her eyes. They were alive, for now they were free, and it was because of him, the silent stranger who had appeared at the very edge of despair. She didn't know his name, she didn't know why he had chosen to help. All she knew was that he had, and in the ruthless country of the West, where mercy was rarer than rain, that was enough to feel like a miracle. As the horse carried them beyond the lights of Dry Creek, Mary's grip on her sister tightened. She whispered through the rushing wind, a promise that trembled but held firm. "I'll protect you, no matter what." And beside them, the silent rancher's eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set, his presence a shield they did not deserve, but had been given all the same. The night swallowed them whole, but it carried with it a fragile, flickering hope. For sometimes salvation did not come with words. Sometimes it came in silence, riding out of the darkness when all else seemed lost.
The desert night carried them far from Dry Creek, but the pounding of hooves could not erase the echoes in Mary's mind. Even as the rancher's horse galloped steady beneath them, even as Eliza clung to her side with eyes squeezed shut, Mary felt the weight of years pressing down. This wasn't just about tonight. This flight, this fear, had been written long before the sheriff ever raised his gun. And as the wind cooled the sweat on her skin, memory rose, sharp as broken glass, soft as the voice of a child she had sworn never to lose. She saw herself younger, Eliza still barely walking, both of them standing in the dirt outside the church steps after their parents were buried. The town had not offered kindness. The preacher said words of comfort, but his eyes darted away too quickly, as though orphans carried disease. Neighbors muttered under their breath. Poor things, some said, but the pity was laced with distance, the kind that pushed rather than pulled. Mary had taken her sister's tiny hand and whispered, "Don't cry. You've got me. That's enough." And she meant it. From then on, the two of them had been their own family, scraping by with odd jobs, cleaning for strangers who barely looked at them, sleeping in barns when landlords turned them out. They wore hunger like a second skin. Yet through it all,
Eliza's laughter had a way of piercing the darkness. It was fragile, fleeting, but it kept Mary standing when the world told her to kneel. But the world had sharp teeth, and one careless mistake could draw blood. It began the day Eliza crossed paths with the son of Dry Creek's wealthiest rancher, Jonathan Hale. He was a man who had never heard no, raised to believe the land, the cattle, and the people all bent to his name. Eliza, with her quiet beauty and shy smile, caught his attention like a spark in dry grass. He followed her down streets, lingered at the well where she drew water, offered words that made her shrink instead of blossom. Mary saw the danger long before her sister did. "Keep away from him," she warned. "Men like that don't know how to take care. They only know how to take." Eliza had nodded, but what choice did she have when Jonathan's shadow fell wherever she went? One evening, while returning laundry she had scrubbed raw for coin, Eliza stumbled into him near the mercantile. He cornered her, laughing at her protests. When she finally broke free, a silver pocket watch slipped from his coat and clattered to the ground. Eliza never saw it, but Jonathan did. And the very next day, the Hale family spread the word that Eliza had stolen it. The town turned fast, like cattle spooked by lightning. It didn't matter that Eliza had never owned anything finer than a faded ribbon. It didn't matter that she wept with confusion, swearing her innocence. The Hales held the land, the cattle, the money that greased every palm. Their word was law, long before the sheriff ever spoke. Sheriff Bolton, the same man who hunted them through the alleys tonight, paid a visit to Mary's shack. His voice had been steady, his eyes cold. "The girl comes with me. Don't make it harder than it has to be." I remember standing in that doorway, wooden floor trembling under my bare feet, my body nothing more than bones in defiance. I remember Eliza's hands clutching at my sleeve, silent tears staining her dress. And I remember the fire that rose inside me, burning hotter than fear. "No," I said simply. The sheriff had smiled, slow and cruel, as if he had been waiting for me to resist. "Then you'll both answer for it."
From that moment on, the sisters had been marked, not just accused, not just judged, but hunted. Work dried up, doors slammed in their faces, whispers followed them like smoke. Thieves, liars, girls without shame. Mary carried the shame, but not for herself. It was for the way men looked at Eliza now, as though the accusation had stripped her of worth, turned her into something less than human. Mary's fists curled each time, her heart threatening to tear itself apart. One night, sitting in the dark, while Eliza cried softly beside her, Mary whispered the vow she had lived by ever since. "If this world wants to take everything from us, then let it. But it will never take you, not while I can still stand." That vow had carried them through nights of hunger, through miles of open desert when they were forced to move on again and again. It had carried them through cold winters where their breath turned to frost in broken bonds, and through blazing summers when their skin cracked under the sun. But vows had a way of drawing enemies, and love became its own kind of crime. Jonathan Hale did not forget the humiliation of being refused, and his family did not forgive the insult of being challenged. They pressed the sheriff harder, feeding him gold and whiskey, until he swore to clean Dry Creek of troublemakers. And so, the noose tightened. The memory faded, but Mary could still feel its weight in her chest as she rode with the silent rancher through the night. She could hear Eliza's quiet sobs, muffled against her shoulder, and she wished she could tear the world apart piece by piece, rebuild it into something kinder. The rancher said nothing, yet Mary felt his presence like a wall between them and the world.
His silence wasn't emptiness, it was protection. His coat smelled of leather and dust, his shoulders steady, his grip on the reins sure. Mary wondered what kind of man risked himself for two strangers hunted by law, and why. But she didn't ask. She only held Eliza tighter, heart hammering with the knowledge that their past had caught them again and would keep catching them until either they broke or something changed. The horse slowed at last, hooves crunching over loose gravel as they reached the outskirts of a canyon. The stars above blazed cold and endless. Here, far from the glow of lanterns, the world seemed vast, almost merciful. The rancher unsealed himself, then helped the sisters down. His hands were rough but gentle, his eyes unreadable in the starlight. He motioned toward a cluster of rocks where a small fire pit lay blackened, old coals scattered by wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Mary guided Eliza to sit, brushing dust from her hair, whispering comfort, though her own voice trembled. The girl leaned against her, exhausted, half asleep from fear and flight. Mary looked at the rancher then, searching his face, trying to read what lived behind his silence. She wanted to thank him, wanted to ask why, but the words stuck in her throat. She had been given too few mercies in life to know what to do with one freely offered. The rancher crouched near the fire pit, struck a spark, and soon a faint flame licked the night. Shadows danced across his face, hard and scarred by years of labor and loss. He glanced at him once, just once, then returned his gaze to the fire. And for the first time in longer than Mary could remember, she felt something close to safety. Yet beneath it all, the vow echoed still, louder now that the past had been stirred. They can call us thieves, liars, outlaws. Let 'em, but they will never take her from me. Never. The night stretched on, heavy with memory, the fire crackling softly between us. And in the silence, Mary wondered if this stranger's shelter would be enough to hold back the storm that was still hunting us, a storm born not just of lies, but of a world that had always wanted to break us.
The prairie stretched endless beneath the starlit sky, wind whispering low as if the land itself carried secrets. The horses' hooves slowed to a weary trot as the rancher guided them off the wagon trail and toward a shadow that loomed against the horizon. It wasn't a home, not anymore. The ranch house leaned tired against the night, its roof missing shingles, one shutter hanging broken. The corral fence sagged, half-rotted, the barn door gaping like the mouth of a wounded beast. Weeds choked the front steps where once flowers might have grown. But to two hunted girls, it was shelter. The rancher swung down from his saddle without a word. His boots struck the dirt with a hollow sound. He tied his horse loosely, then gestured for Mary and Eliza to follow. They hesitated, Mary clutching her sister's hand as if the darkness might swallow them whole. But the faint glow of moonlight on the rancher's face was steady, unthreatening, and so they followed. Inside, dust coated every surface, motes swirling in the lantern light he struck. The air smelled of cedar and old hay. A table leaned crooked against the wall, two chairs still standing, others broken and scattered. A cold fireplace yawned at the center of the room. Without asking, the rancher gathered wood from a pile stacked long ago in the corner. He kneeled, struck flint, and soon a flame began to dance, throwing long shadows across the cracked walls. He placed a folded blanket on the floor near the fire, then another. His hands moved with quiet efficiency, every gesture spare and deliberate. Mary watched, suspicion carved deep into the lines of her face. She had seen men offer kindness only to demand a price later. She had learned that mercy was often another form of control. At last she spoke, her voice rough. "Why are you helping us?" The rancher didn't answer. His back was to them, shoulders broad beneath a worn coat. He adjusted the fire, fed it another log, and only when it caught strong did he turn. His eyes met hers, dark, steady, unreadable. He said nothing. Mary's jaw tightened. She hated silence almost as much as she hated lies. At least lies could be fought against. Silence left her stranded in uncertainty. Eliza, by contrast, knelt near the fire with a childlike awe, warming her hands against the flames. Her face softened for the first time in days. She looked up at the man and whispered, "Thank you." The rancher gave the smallest nod, then turned back to the fire. That was all. Mary pulled her sister closer, lowering her voice. "We don't know him. Don't trust too quick." But Eliza only shook her head. "He saved us. Maybe that's all that matters." Mary didn't argue, but she kept her gaze fixed on the rancher as though he were another storm waiting to break. The hours bled into one another. The fire crackled. The wind outside rattled through the broken boards of the barn. Every sound carried the weight of danger, of men who might be searching even now, of the sheriff's lanterns cutting through the dark. Yet in that abandoned ranch the world felt paused, as if time itself held its breath. The rancher offered no story, no explanation. He left the sisters by the fire and stepped outside, his silhouette framed by starlight as he checked the horses, secured the gate, walked the perimeter with the patience of a man used to solitude.
Eliza eventually curled against Mary, drifting into a restless sleep. Mary stroked her sister's hair, eyes never leaving the shadow beyond the doorway where the rancher moved. Questions gnawed at her: who he was, why he chose them, what he stood to gain. Men didn't risk themselves without reason. And yet there was no cruelty in him, no hunger in his gaze. His silence was not the silence of secrets, but the silence of a man who had long ago laid words aside. When he finally stepped back inside, his boots carrying the scent of earth and cold air, Mary asked again, sharper this time, "Why us? Why now? You could have left us. You should have. The sheriff doesn't forgive." The rancher's eyes flickered briefly to Eliza, sleeping softly against her sister's lap. Then back to Mary. He did not speak, but something in his gaze shifted. A shadow of memory, a grief too deep to give words. Mary felt her chest tighten, though she didn't understand why. The rancher pulled off his coat, heavy with dust and leather, and laid it gently over the two sisters. He turned away before she could protest, settling himself on the floor near the far wall. His hat tilted low, eyes closed, as though sleep could find him even in such a broken place. Mary sat stiff for a long while, staring at the coat that now warmed them, at the fire that he had built, at the silence that shielded more than threatened. Her suspicion warred with a strange, unwelcome sense of safety. She had not felt it in years, perhaps ever. Slowly, her shoulders eased. In that fragile quiet, Mary realized something. Sometimes the fiercest protection did not come with promises or boasts. Sometimes it came from a silence that refused to let harm through. She whispered into the fire, so low even Eliza did not stir. "If you mean us harm, I'll stop you. But if you don't, maybe God sent you." The rancher did not stir. Outside, the prairie stretched infinite, stars burning cold above the ruin of the world. Inside, by the broken hearth of a forgotten ranch, 3 souls shared the smallest flicker of peace. And for Mary, who had lived her life waiting for the world to take something more from her, that flicker felt like the beginning of something she could not yet name. A shelter, a pause, a fragile trust, born not of words, but of the silence of a man who, for reasons known only to himself, chose to stand between 2 sisters and the storm that hunted them.
Night fell across the prairie, so dark that only the flicker of firelight remained in the corner of the abandoned ranch house. Mary sat silently by the flames, clutching Eliza's thin hand in her own, her eyes never leaving the stranger who sat a few steps away. He was quiet, brooding like the night itself, moving only now and then to prod the fire with a stick, never saying a word. That silence unsettled Mary at first, but as time passed, it grew into a strange rhythm, a fragile peace, unlike the noisy, dangerous world of the town. Eliza had begun to trust him. She smiled whenever he handed her an old but still warm blanket or carefully cut a piece of hard bread for her to eat. "He's not as bad as you think, Mary," Eliza whispered into her sister's ear. Mary stayed silent, her eyes sharp and guarded. In the world they lived in, kindness was never free. One night, after Eliza had fallen asleep, Mary stayed awake. She watched the rancher's shadow stretch long in the firelight, his frame lean but sturdy, his face marked with lines of weariness. For the first time, Mary noticed a deep sorrow hidden in his eyes, a sorrow that could not be disguised. She wanted to ask, but her throat closed around the words. Then a sudden gust swept dust through the air, dimming the fire, and in the half-darkness she heard him whisper, not to her, but to himself, "If only I'd been a little faster, maybe they wouldn't have died." Mary froze. That single sentence opened a hidden door. The next morning, while Eliza went to gather wood, with the horses grazing at a distance, Mary approached him. "Who did you lose?" she asked softly, wary but unable to contain her curiosity. The rancher didn't look at her. He simply lit a cigarette, smoke curling through the air. It took a long while before he exhaled and spoke. "The sheriff in town once came after me. They accused me of running liquor, though I was nothing but a rancher. My wife and my little boy were caught in the chase. I couldn't save them." His voice sank low, like an old wound bleeding open again. Mary's chest tightened, as though someone had reached inside and crushed her heart. The same man, the same enemy, the same tragedy of injustice. For the first time, his eyes met hers directly. In that silence, Mary understood. His quietness wasn't born of indifference, but of a grief so deep that words had long since lost their meaning. From that moment, something inside Mary softened. She no longer saw him as a suspicious stranger, but as a soul who had tasted the same abandonment and pain. And strangely, in that fragile silence, she felt a thread of kinship binding them together. But peace never lingers long. One afternoon, while Eliza was laughing and playing with a young colt outside, Mary saw dust rising on the horizon. Her heart clenched instantly. She recognized the silhouettes of armed riders, men of the sheriff. Panic shot through her. She pulled Eliza inside. "They found us." The rancher was already standing by the door, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. He said nothing, only stared outward, his eyes turning to cold steel. The pounding of hooves grew nearer, and then a familiar voice thundered from the yard. "We know they're hiding here.
Hand the girls over and you stay out of it, or you'll share their fate." Eliza trembled and clung to Mary's waist. Mary swallowed hard, her heart beat wild, her gaze flicking to the rancher. But he didn't move, didn't flinch. In his eyes, Mary saw for the first time an unshakable resolve. This time, he would not let the people who needed him be taken. Mary squeezed her sister's hand, whispering, "We're not alone anymore." Outside, the sheriff's laugh was sharp, followed by the crack of a whip in the air. "I'll count to 3. If you don't come out, I'll burn this rotten ranch to the ground." The rancher turned to Mary, his eyes deep, carrying both a question and a promise. Mary gave a small nod. In that brief instant, she gave all her trust to a man she had doubted only days before. The gun clicked softly as it was loaded. The fire in the hearth still burned, but in Mary's eyes, another fire seemed to ignite. The fire of hope, the fragile bond of outcasts who had nothing left but each other. They didn't know if they would survive the night, but for the first time, Mary felt they weren't running alone anymore. And even as danger closed in that fragile silence, something was stirring. Faith, and perhaps the beginnings of a feeling she couldn't yet name.
The sheriff spurred his horse, charging toward the door. But as he raised his gun, Mary stepped forward. Her rifle cracked, the shot ripping through the night. The sheriff jerked back, his weapon flying from his hand. His horse bucked, and he crashed to the dirt with a roar. The rancher was on him in an instant, boots pounding across the porch. He stood over the sheriff, revolver aimed straight at the man who had ruined his life. The sheriff lay there, gasping, his arrogance fading into fear. "Do it," the sheriff spat, blood on his lips. "Finish it, like the outlaw you are." The rancher's finger tightened on the trigger. Mary stood frozen, Eliza clutching her sleeve. The firelight carved deep lines across his face, and for a moment he was no longer just a man. He was every wound, every injustice, every drop of grief made flesh. But then his hand trembled. He lowered the gun. "No, I won't be you." The sheriff stared, wide-eyed, as the rancher stepped back. His men, broken and scattered, fled into the dark. The lawman who once ruled with fear now lay in the dirt, powerless, his reign crumbling with the silence that followed. Mary felt her knees give way, her rifle slipping from her fingers. The fight was over. It was truly over. The first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, painting the ranch in gold. Smoke curled into the morning sky, but the flames had died, leaving only the faint scent of ash. Eliza stood at the doorway, tears streaking her face, but a smile trembling on her lips. Mary turned to the rancher. He stood motionless, staring at the horizon as though seeing something he hadn't in years. The grief in his eyes was still there, but it no longer swallowed him whole. It had given way to something else, something fragile, like a wound beginning to heal. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You don't have to live in silence anymore." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned his gaze to her. In his eyes burned a promise, not spoken, but deeper than any words. The promise of a beginning. Eliza ran forward, throwing her arms around them both. Mary held her tight, and the rancher reached out, hesitant at first, then certain, his rough hands closing over theirs. The three of them stood there as the sun rose, bathed in the light of a day that felt entirely new. They were scarred, broken in places, but together they were no longer hunted, no longer alone. And in that fragile dawn, amid the silence of the prairie, something unspoken bloomed between them. Hope, kinship, and perhaps the first stirrings of love, born from loss, forged in fire,
and carried forward into the uncertain but healing light of tomorrow.
The sheriff spurred his horse, charging toward the door. But as he raised his gun, Mary stepped forward. Her rifle cracked, the shot ripping through the night. The sheriff jerked back, his weapon flying from his hand. His horse bucked, and he crashed to the dirt with a roar. The rancher was on him in an instant, boots pounding across the porch. He stood over the sheriff, revolver aimed straight at the man who had ruined his life. The sheriff lay there, gasping, his arrogance fading into fear. "Do it," the sheriff spat, blood on his lips. "Finish it, like the outlaw you are." The rancher's finger tightened on the trigger. Mary stood frozen, Eliza clutching her sleeve. The firelight carved deep lines across his face, and for a moment he was no longer just a man. He was every wound, every injustice, every drop of grief made flesh. But then his hand trembled. He lowered the gun. "No," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I won't be you." The sheriff stared, wide-eyed, as the rancher stepped back. His men, broken and scattered, fled into the dark. The lawman who had once ruled with fear now lay in the dirt, powerless, his reign crumbling with the silence that followed. Mary felt her knees give way, her rifle slipping from her fingers. The fight was over. It was truly over. The first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, painting the ranch in gold. Smoke curled into the morning sky, but the flames had died, leaving only the faint scent of ash. Eliza stood at the doorway, tears streaking her face, but a smile trembling on her lips. Mary turned to the rancher. He stood motionless, staring at the horizon, as though seeing something he hadn't in years. The grief in his eyes was still there, but it no longer swallowed him whole. It had given way to something else, something fragile, like a wound beginning to heal. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You don't have to live in silence anymore." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned his gaze to her. In his eyes burned a promise, not spoken, but deeper than any words, the promise of a beginning. Eliza ran forward, throwing her arms around them both. Mary held her tight, and the rancher reached out, hesitant at first, then certain, his rough hands closing over theirs. The three of them stood there as the sun rose, bathed in the light of a day that felt entirely new. They were scarred, broken in places, but together they were no longer hunted, no longer alone. And in that fragile dawn, amid the silence of the prairie, something unspoken bloomed between them. Hope, kinship, and perhaps the first stirrings of love, born from loss, forged in fire, and carried forward into the uncertain but healing light of tomorrow.